Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Back again to talk about probably one of the most anticipated bosses coming up in the Eternal Palace, the Blackwater Behemoth. I've seen a lot of people making some assumptions about the encounter, or even posting reviews about the encounter that, in my opinion, don't really do it justice. And while I'm not here to defend the encounter, in some cases I think there's some very harsh criticism for it, I don't think it's as hyped up as people are trying to build it up to be. This has been a fight that some people are calling a total disaster, a total flop, and whatever, right? And I don't quite think it is that. It's a very simple fight, but I think for a second boss, it kind of makes sense for it to be very simple and very easy for people to get through. There are some bugs without a doubt, especially in terms of its hitbox and some of the health pool of, for example, the pufferfish, but I think this is far from a disastrous fight. I think it's far from the end of the world on this one. So starting off, Blackwater Behemoth starts off in one cave. There's actually a total of 2 platforms on this encounter. Start off at 1, and the boss is just kind of chilling in this cave, and he stays there the whole time, flanked by 2 pufferfish. If you go across the breach to go to the next platform here, you will find that there's a couple jellyfish that are a little bit floating around as you go out there. If you pick up this bioluminescence buff, which also spawns from the pufferfish whenever you kill one of them, then not only are you able to heal, because you're unable to heal anybody while they are underwater unless they have bioluminescence, but you also are able to be eaten by any of the abyss dwellers that come out. So as we look at this fight, it is a lot more simple than some people kind of give it credit, and it's not as complicated as some people like to think it is. So as you start the fight, one of the easiest things to do is actually just start burning down the pufferfish before the pull. You don't have to engage with the boss to be able to do with that, and to start burning down that pufferfish. And while I'm not sure if that was the intent of the boss, that's where it stands right now off of testing. So you can easily get one down to 10% HP. You can get both of them down to 10% HP if you wanted to, and then you're actually able to manipulate their movement through Death Grip. One thing I'm a little bit, I guess, concerned with, or one thing I didn't like about it once I saw it, was the fact that something like Shining Force, which is kind of like a burst effect that comes from the priest, while it can go anywhere in a 2D environment, it actually doesn't push it straight down. So you have to have a Death Knight to be able to manipulate the ad's positioning. Another piece of criticism that a lot of people talked about was how their ground effects didn't work because they're sitting there floating in water. And to counter that, you just sit on the water and you're done, right? They were saying, oh, I can't actually use a feast because we're in the water. I'm like, just put it on the ground and then swim to the ground and then eat the food and then you're good. So those things kind of baffled me. Or saying, you know, Shaman's not able to deal with this fight, or something along, because my totems aren't going to work. Just get everybody on the ground. And as we ended up doing testing, that's what we ended up doing, and that's one of the things that ended up helping us out a lot, was actually just bringing the boss onto the ground, or sorry, bringing the entirety of the raid onto the ground, bringing the pufferfish down with it, and then we started having some of the more self-sustaining classes, the more defensive classes, say like Warlock, be able to go from a higher altitude in the water, take that top part of the sphere where we'd have the pufferfish burst, while the melee would come in from the front of the sphere, the rest of the range would come in from the back, and then everybody ended up on the ocean floor. This allowed us to use things like Warlock gateways. It allowed us to use things like grip very easily to be able to make sure the tank stayed within range, and it greatly eased the annoyance or pain of having to deal with that chain lightning. While the chain lightning was pretty overtuned for heroic, having boss abilities overtuned in heroic raid testing is never a surprise, right? There's always going to be events that are overtuned. There's always going to be those issues that sort of stand out. But I think one of the things that gave people the most anger or angst is just the fact that the fight is weird. The fight's weird and operates on a 3-dimensional plane, and you have to be able to change your movement accordingly to be able to benefit that. But once you actually start playing with it, while you are very slow in the water, and while that needs to be fixed and needs to be adjusted a little bit, and maybe the knockback helped out quite a bit, it's actually not that difficult of a fight to deal with. And while it is very simplistic, like I said, that's something that you kind of expect out of a second boss fight. Something that's going to be overly intense and overly mechanically intensive, something like Unat, would not do well in an underwater environment no matter how you spin it. because there's just so much going on. There's so much that you have to get used to in terms of the obstacles that are coming out there, and overall it doesn't really seem like it'd be something that would work too well. Melee seems like it'd be kind of a pain on this fight, and some positioning that goes into it can be alleviated a little bit by Warlock gateways. And the swim to go from breach to breach is very long and very intensive, and I think that's something where they adjust the slipstream benefit. So a number of pieces of this fight are what I would call annoying, but not game-breaking or don't destroy the fight. Increasing melee hitbox, for example, increasing the sphere radius of the pufferfish and decreasing their health pool makes things a lot easier. Allowing things like Typhoon or Shining Force to come into play, where you're able to manipulate the movement of the pufferfish where you want it to go. So if you don't have a Death Knight, you're not going to be totally screwed and unable to get that pufferfish down to the ocean floor where the rest of the raid is presiding. Some of those things can start helping the boss and making it a lot easier to deal with. But in general, it's just a simple boss fight. Not too much different than something we saw out of Mother. We saw it out of like Champion of Light. Grong, well, I think with Grong was be a little more fun, maybe a little bit more going on with it. This is just an early boss fight in a raid that's trying to try something new. Whenever you're in an underwater environment, I'm not surprised that there's going to be an underwater boss going into it. And in many cases, especially this expansion, most of the early bosses have been very simplistic, had a couple little flavor things tossed into them, and then they shipped it. And I think that's one of the things that many people kind of have to get used to, is that the early bosses are meant to be at that green level. They're meant to be at that green level. They're meant to be easy. They're meant to be able to run them over with minimal issues and strategy. But from a lot of the VODs I was seeing or videos I was seeing of people posting it, they're swimming, you know, almost eye level with the behemoth, and they're pulsing all over each other because they have this single point of entry going into the sphere and pulsing onto each other, which is just a recipe for disaster. So in many cases, I think this fight has some solid benefits to it, and in general will go down as one of those fights that is like, oh, okay, that was all right, that was fine, not a big deal. And once people start executing the strategy properly, or finding even better ones than we found in our hour of testing on PTR, I think it's far from a bad fight, and I think it's just something that stands out as a point where Blizzard should always be encouraged to iterate on different things. While one of my least favorite fights of last expansion was ANR, probably because of the annoyance that it provided to healers in terms of just running back and forth and then killing trash mobs that didn't really fight back, I would say that this fight in particular is a lot more interactive than that, and also shows and highlights the need for them to continue innovating and continue building off of fights. Because whenever you go into a boss encounter and then you start using historical fights to be able to start describing mechanics, then you start seeing that there's derivative issues. Then you start seeing that, okay, this is just like this other fight. This draws the same kind of thing. This takes one mechanic from this fight, one mechanic from this fight, and then you're done. While Tomb of Sargeras, for example, had a lot of very fun encounters, it was also dominated by soaking mechanics, right? And whenever you look at the entire instance as a whole, while there were some very good boss fights on him, you look at the entire instance as a whole, you say, wow, that had way too many similarities. It felt too much the same. Whenever you're looking at a raid as a whole and you're looking at it back in time, you think of something like Throne of Thunder as being an amazing fight that you really enjoyed. Well, that was in part because there was a very wide variety in terms of mechanics that were going on. And there was a lot more experimentation, even if some fights didn't work out the way they intended, like Dark Animus, right? Overall, I'm pretty excited thus far for the Eternal Palace. I think some of my concerns with the raid encounter thus far kind of mirror what we've seen out of Dazar'alor, and maybe it's kind of led by Dazar'alor, where Dazar'alor had a number of fights that were very fun and heroic, and while we haven't seen the mythic testing yet, this is going to be a key point that I'm looking at going forward, that there are so many issues with Dazar'alor fights not really growing. And what I mean by that is that they didn't really change up their mechanics, their vibe, as you went from Mythic. It didn't feel Mythic. Jadefire Masters is an example. You get an extra orb to kill, the wall's a little bit tougher to deal with, but you still Warlock Gateway through it, and at the end of the fight, if you burn the right mob properly, you burn the right mob properly. And the only difference is this time you get teleported up earlier in the fight and you have to deal with that mechanic, right? Even if your damage is good, if your damage is bad, you have to deal with that mechanic all the same. Rastakhan was another one where in many cases you had the same thing going on, where it felt very much like heroic and the fights didn't grow and feel very innovative as you went to Mythic mode. That's one of the things as we're looking at Mythic testing coming right around the corner. We've tested 7 of the 8 heroic bosses thus far, with Azshara coming up this Friday. So be sure to tune into the live stream linked in the description below as well to check that out as we test that live. But so far, we've seen these fights coming out, and they seem very fun. Some of the fights, for example, like the hatchery, were very incomplete. You had the boss just kind of do nothing once you chased him down to his little lair at the end. Some things were easily abusable, like being able to dodge any kind of ground effects by standing outside the arena and then firing into it as a ranged DPS, right? Some of those things are just kind of, well, I'd say laughable bugs and things that just kind of stand out that should get fixed well before we ever touch it on live servers. But assuming that those things go out, I think this raid so far has given me more of a 7 in terms of quality out of 10. And if Mythic mode continues to grow, I think that we could definitely increase that score quite a bit. So let me know what you guys think if you've seen some of the VODs of Eternal Palace thus far. Be sure to check out the live stream, as I mentioned in the description below, because we will be testing Heroic Azshara this weekend. And of course, anytime that we're doing any Mythic testing, we'll definitely be doing that too. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I hope you all enjoyed it. Give me your thoughts as well on the boss if you tested it, and I'll catch y'all next time.